A fine day in history, George Bush said a short while ago after having a 20-minute conversation with Mikhail Gorbachev at his summer residence in the Crimea. We're going to go to Moscow very quickly now because the Soviet Evening News Bulletin, the main bulletin on Vremya, has just begun. Let's hear what the announcer has to say.
He's completely in charge of the situation, and that his links with the country, disrupted by the actions of a criminal group, has been completely restored. He has returned to his duties. He has had a phone conversation with Kravchuk, Nazarbayev, Yeltsin, and others, all of whom unanimously denounced the illegal coup which disrupted the democratic forces of the country. These anti-constitutional actions were not supported either by the heads of the republics or by the highest authorities. The adventurists will bear full responsibility for their illegal acts. Mr. Gorbachev gave instructions to the chief of staff.
We'll keep our eye on this for just a couple of minutes here while we bring you up to date. He's making some reference there to the contacts Mr. Gorbachev is now having outside his residence now, including he's going to be accompanied back to Moscow, we're told, by two of the Republic leaders, Nursultan Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan, and as you may have just heard the announcer there say, Leonid Kravchuk, who is the leader in the Ukraine. Now, the Agence France-Presse, the French news agency, is saying that Mr. Gorbachev is due back in Moscow in a very short period of time. When he comes back, there's some rumors he'll hold a news conference, but we do not know the basis of any of this at the moment. But the coup that has failed has definitively failed, at least for now, as far as everybody universally can tell, including President Bush. Let's go briefly to the Pentagon, where ABC's Bob Zelnick is standing by. Bob, what do we know about the men who plotted this coup, or plotted and mounted this coup against Mr. Gorbachev? Where are they now?
Peter, there's no Pentagon information on their whereabouts and no confirmation of earlier reports that General Yazov committed suicide. In point of fact, most of the viewing of this building is on the Soviet Army and assessments of which units were involved and whether the Army can be relied upon now to serve its once and future master, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Now, President Bush did say that in the conversations with some people that Mikhail Moiseev, the commander of the Soviet military, had ordered all troops back to base. Is that correct?
Yes, and what's more, it is the view of U.S. military experts that Moiseev was not involved with the coup, opposed the coup, and resisted efforts to get him to join it.
Okay, Bob Zelnick, thanks very much. At the Pentagon, we've now seen further evidence of Soviet military on the ground in Moscow returning to its bases. It's a little after 9 o'clock in the evening there. These films are from a couple of hours ago. It is still fairly light in parts of the Soviet Union, but not in Moscow. As troops continue to return, that's the Kremlin itself returning to their bases under the instructions of the Armed Forces Commander. Up at Kennebunkport in Maine, where President Bush is finally going to get a little time to himself, ABC's Britt Hume is standing by. Britt, a question about a conversation that Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, had with Mr. Yakovlev, one of Mr. Gorbachev's former advisors, to which the President referred. Do you know what they were talking about at all?
Well, I do, Peter, know this about it, that Yakovlev, of course, is the former senior Gorbachev advisor who had warned only days before this development occurred publicly that such a thing, a Stalinist-type coup, might well occur. And obviously, the administration was interested in his assessment now of what these events of the last 12 to 24 hours mean, and they were obviously pleased to hear that that Yakovlev agrees with what now is the prevailing assessment, that it tried and failed. The administration is prepared to go along with that, with only one exception. The administration doesn't know and doesn't have any good intelligence on where the Gang of Eight, so-called, are, and that's the last thing that worries them.
Okay, Britt Hume at Kennebunkport in Maine, thank you very much. The Gang of Eight, or the Gang of Five, or the Gang of however many. You may have heard many reports today. First, they were on the way to the Crimea. Then they were on their way to a distant Soviet republic over by the Chinese border. As Britt says, we do not know. We will keep you in touch. There's a lot of second-guessing going on in Moscow, a lot of reappraisal, and a lot of explanation. On World News Tonight, we'll try to pull it all together. But if Mr. Gorbachev shows up in the meantime, we will certainly be here. I'm Peter Jennings. In a new era.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. A great day in the middle of history, said President Bush, and given the history of the Soviet Union, who would have believed it 60 hours ago? Tonight, Mikhail Gorbachev is again president of the Soviet Union. The men who try to bring him down are either under arrest or being hunted. We're not absolutely sure. Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president, once dismissed as a loose cannon on the Soviet political scene, has stared the cannons down and emerged as the man who's kept the Soviet Union from being plunged backwards. The pace of events today has been difficult to keep up with, and there are still some mysteries. We'll begin in Moscow, of course, with our bureau chief there, Jim Laurie.
To people manning the barricades here, the first sign the coup was faltering lay in the fact there was no all-out attack on the Russian Federation headquarters. 3 civilians had died last night when light tanks tried to slam through a barricade. But today, civilians mounted the abandoned vehicles and drove them away. Then Boris Yeltsin went before the Russian parliament to reveal one of the coup leaders, KGB chief Khrushchev, had agreed to send a delegation to meet with Gorbachev under house arrest in the Crimea. The delegation was soon on its way. Yeltsin also reported key members of what he had called the criminal junta were flying to the Crimea as well. Some reports said they wanted to cut a deal. Another said they had gone to apologize. On Soviet television, the newscaster was suddenly free to report what he wanted. "I'm sorry to have lost my place," he said. "I'm so excited." By early afternoon, military convoys were seen heading out of Moscow. Tank drivers confirmed the coup was ending. The withdrawal came after dissension had developed in the military. At least 2 crack airborne divisions revealed they had thrown their allegiance to Yeltsin. With the area near the Kremlin empty of troops, people gathered for a victory rally outside KGB headquarters. Late in the afternoon, Gorbachev's allies started to reappear, including Foreign Minister Besmertnik, who told reporters he really had been ill.
And even now, I have a temperature. My doctor, sitting there, can confirm this. I was not detained at any time.
By early evening, the Soviet media reported the Committee of 8 had been disbanded. The parliament had formally reinstated Gorbachev as president, and the federal prosecutor had begun criminal proceedings against the coup plotters. Independent Russian TV was back on the air, satirizing state television for having been puppets of the hardline junta. Tens of thousands of people outside Boris Yeltsin's headquarters were elated. In their view, he had saved the day. Victoriously, they waved the Russian flag, and one speaker said, the black night of fear had become a new day of freedom. And yet, the barricades around the Yeltsin headquarters remained up tonight, in fact, reinforced. The coup may be over, but with the fate of the coup plotters unclear, a lot of uncertainty and distrust remain. Boris Yeltsin's aides, in fact, warned tonight that the barricade should be kept up because there may very well be desperate junta loyalists who may try to cause trouble faced with their defeat. Peter?
But, Jim, as far as we know, Mr. Gorbachev is now finally, after some delay, returning to the Soviet capital.
That's correct, Peter. He is due to fly in here from the Crimea, escorted by a few of his aides and those that went down to meet him earlier today.
And all those people who've been demonstrating today, one wonders whether they've been demonstrating for Mr. Gorbachev or for Mr. Yeltsin.
I was out there earlier today, and the emotion was plain. It was for Mr. Yeltsin. There is still not a great deal of popularity or sympathy for Mr. Gorbachev. Yeltsin is the man that has made all of this possible. At least that's the view of the people. And he has been acting very presidential in the last few days, and he still has been issuing decrees. Even tonight, for example, he criticized the state television, saying that the chief of state TV should be replaced because he was indeed a puppet of the criminals, as he put it, who launched this coup attempt.
Okay, Jim Laurie, our bureau chief in Moscow, thanks very much, bearing in mind that he is at the very heart of the Russian Republic. But here's an example of the distrust that Jim Laurie was talking about in his report. The chairman of Boris Yeltsin's defense committee, General Konstantin Kubets, was asked if he was sure the coup had collapsed. I will be sure, he replied, only when I have the firing squad that will execute these scoundrels. For the people out there with whom Jim was, most of them young, those on the barricades, it is now time to celebrate. Here's ABC's Rick Inderfirth.
Alexei Lysansky is 18 years old, an economics student at Moscow State University. He decided to come here soon after Soviet tanks rolled into the city, but first had to convince his mother.
She was very much afraid, and she didn't want me to go there. So I had a very difficult talk with her. So I tried to prove that it's my duty to come here.
She let him come, but he admits he was frightened, especially last night when he heard about the 3 protesters who had been killed nearby. Alexei says he was surprised that the coup collapsed so quickly. He believes Boris Yeltsin deserves much of the credit, and that it was also a victory for the Russian people.
We made another step on the way to democracy.
Natalia Greenlow is a teacher. She and her husband arrived yesterday.
We came here because we considered it to be our really civil duty to be here at that moment.
Her civil duty, a concept that is beginning to take hold in Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union. Natalia believes people will be glad to see him again.
They would be happy when he will occupy his place, which really belongs to him.
Others here say they still have questions about Gorbachev.
People think of Gorbachev as they did before all this happened. They still don't have complete faith in him.
But there was little talk of that tonight. With the crisis over, they held a concert and called it Rock on the Barricades. It was time for a celebration. They had taken their stand against repression and for freedom. And they had won. Rick Inderfirth, ABC News, Moscow.
There is much more, and we'll be back in a moment.
This is World News Tonight with Peter.
It was complicated enough before the coup. But even with Mr. Gorbachev back, it is clear that Mr. Yeltsin now figures into America's calculations more than ever. ABC's Britt Hume is with the president in Kennebunkport.
Early this afternoon, the president was out on his boat off the Maine coast when word came from shore that sent him zooming back in. His phone call to Mikhail Gorbachev had finally gone through. Mr. Bush spoke to him from the bedroom of his summer home for about 20 minutes.
He sounded in good physical condition. Indeed, his voice was buoyant. In his view, the constitutional authorities are back in power, and democracy and freedom and reform have prevailed.
The president was asked what it would mean for relations with the U.S. that the Soviet reactionaries had been set back.
They tried and they failed, and democracy prevailed and reform prevailed. And that's what this is all about. So I think that I expect the relationship to be, if anything, even better.
Better, perhaps, but as the president had earlier implied, also different, since U.S. policy must now take into account the emergence of Boris Yeltsin.
It leaves the world looking at him as a very courageous individual, duly elected by the people, standing firmly and courageously for democracy and freedom with enormous stature as a result of that.
But what about the flamboyance that had earlier caused U.S. policymakers to view Yeltsin with suspicion?
I don't detect any less flamboyance, and in this instance, the flamboyance is a very positive quality as you climb up there and encourage your people.
The president says the central lesson in all of this is that once democracy and freedom have gotten started, they cannot easily be stopped. That is no doubt what he really believes, but it is also what he would like Gorbachev and Yeltsin and whoever else ends up in authority in Moscow to believe as well. Peter?
Brett, I'd like to take the Yeltsin factor just a little further. The president's been saying Gorbachev, Yeltsin in the same breath all day. Are we hearing realistically the new policy that you've got to deal equally with the two now?
Absolutely we are. I think the president has not only in a hard sort of realistic sense gauged Yeltsin as being a major political factor in the Soviet Union, but my sense as well, Peter, is that he has been personally impressed with Yeltsin, particularly with his courage in standing up the way he did when the outcome was by no means clear.
Okay, Britt, thanks very much. By some accounts, it is not absolutely clear everywhere in the country. The coup may be over, Mr. Gorbachev on his way back to Moscow, but there is a report tonight from Lithuania, and that's the Republic of Lithuania, that Soviet troops and Lithuanian security guards have exchanged gunfire near the parliament buildings in Vilnius. A spokesman for the parliament says the shots were fired when the Soviet troops there tried to force their way onto the parliamentary grounds, and one person on each side, according to our reporting, was wounded. We'll have more in just a moment. Into motion on Sunday night, those who knew that Mr. Gorbachev was vulnerable were shocked, even though they were not surprised. They'd often talk to us about the determination of some Communist Party officials to bring Mr. Gorbachev down. Now, there are going to be many versions of why the coup failed, depending on who tells the tale. Some of Mr. Gorbachev's younger aides have told Diane Sawyer their version.
If you really want to understand how badly the leaders of the coup miscalculated, Gorbachev's aides say you have to go back to Monday morning. Gorbachev was already under house arrest when the leaders decided to turn their attention to Boris Yeltsin, but it was already too late. The KGB reportedly arrived at Yeltsin's house to place him under house arrest 40 minutes after he had already gone, racing to the parliament building where he could surround himself with supporters and start organizing. It was there that he called for people to pour into the streets. They came. His amateur radio broadcasters urged demonstrations in other cities. They demonstrated. He asked miners to go on strike. They did. In the meantime, the leaders of the coup discovered their tanks weren't as terrifying as they'd thought, and they were manned by soldiers who were making friends with the protesters. Once the emergency committee did try to offer a carrot, a promise of increased wages, but KGB officers in plain clothes reported back that the crowd had simply laughed. The leaders of the coup may also have miscalculated international reaction. They remembered that in the end, Tiananmen Square only got the Chinese a tongue-lashing. But this time, the West, led by President Bush, refused to recognize the new government and then announced in rapid-fire succession the suspension of technical and economic aid. And then last night, even as some very hardliners argued for an assault on the parliament building, Yeltsin responded with a dazzling psychological counterattack. He started phoning coup members individually, trying to split up the group, warning each in turn that the eyes and cameras of the world would never forgive the man who ordered open fire. No one gave the order. And then today, from his office, Yeltsin followed up with individual negotiations with coup leaders. Negotiations which successfully drove in the wedges that finally split the coup apart. But whatever the chronology, Gorbachev's aides say, in the end, the coup was doomed by the cynicism of its leaders, by men who simply refused to believe how much things and people could change after a little taste of freedom. Peter?
Diane Sawyer in Moscow. As we said, many tales. Here's another theory on why the coup failed, that it was supposed to fail. The former Foreign Minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, says it was also strange that he suspects the coup may have been staged by Gorbachev himself. So does the President of the Republic of Georgia. And even in Washington there is scuttlebutt, which is another word for gossip, that Gorbachev may have done it to smoke out his real opposition so he could identify it all. President Bush says this is a ridiculous idea, but in these circumstances, conspiracy theories often develop a life of their own. And yet another view from the man who used to be one of Mikhail Gorbachev's closest aides, Alexander Yakovlev, who warned the coup was imminent, says the blame ultimately rests with Mikhail Gorbachev himself, for, in Mr. Yakovlev's words, forming a team of traitors. The Pentagon analysts have their own ideas about what went wrong, at least from a military standpoint. Bob Zelnick joins us from the Pentagon. Bob.
Peter, Pentagon analysts say the Soviet military never crushed its opposition because those who led the coup never gave definitive orders for it to attack. In fact, they say that planning for the coup was so bungled that its leaders never reached accord among themselves when or under what circumstances to use force. As a result, key decisions were left to local commanders with the obvious results. In fact, Peter, those who monitored the coup from beginning to end say there was no instance where Soviet soldiers actually defied orders. In many cases, the orders just never came.
Now, Bob, the man who's ostensibly in charge at the moment is Mikhail Moiseyev, who's the commander of the joint forces, the commander of the overall forces. What do they think of him?
Well, Pentagon officials who have spent time with Moiseyev regard him as a likable but tough guy of no particular creativity or imagination. He's a soldier who's very good at doing one thing, and that's following orders. In fact, many here believe he was away on vacation during the final hours when the coup was being planned, and thus missed the opportunity to join it until he had a chance to see which way the wind was blowing.
Okay, Bob Zelnick of the Pentagon, thank you very much. His orders tonight from Mr. Gorbachev are to do only what Mr. Gorbachev tells him to do. We'll have more news in a moment. University and